could not help expressing himself. So, let me see if I get this straight. Do you mean that the paper is to go to press without a word of the prize fight in it? Norman says, yes, that's exactly what I mean. But that's unheard of. All the other papers are going to print it. What will our subscribers say? Why, it's simply... Clark paused, unable to find words to express his incredulity. Norman looked at Clark thoughtfully. The managing editor was a member of a church of a different denomination from that of Norman's. The two men had never talked together about religious things before, although they'd been associated on the paper for several years now. Come in here a minute, Clark, and shut the door, said Norman. Clark came in, and the two men faced each other alone. Clark didn't speak for a minute, and then he said abruptly, Clark, if Jesus was editor of a daily paper, do you honestly think he would print 3.5 columns of prize fight commentary in it? And Clark thought about that a minute, and he says, no, I don't suppose he would. Well, Norman said, that's my only reason for omitting this account from the news. I have decided not to do anything in connection with the paper for a whole year that I honestly believe that Jesus wouldn't do. Clark couldn't have looked more amazed if the chief had suddenly gone crazy. In fact, he did think something like that was wrong, although Mr. Norman was one of the last men in the world, in his judgment, to lose his mind. So he says, what effect is that going to have on the paper? And Norman says, well, what do you think? Well, I think it'll simply ruin the paper, replied Clark promptly. He was gathering up his bewildered senses and began to object. He says, why, it isn't feasible to run a paper nowadays on any such basis. It's too idealistic. The world isn't ready for it. You can't make it pay for itself. Just as sure as you live, if you omit this prize fight report, you're going to lose hundreds of subscribers. It doesn't take a prophet to see that. The very best people in town are eager to read it. They know the fight took place. And when they get the paper this evening, they're going to expect a half a page at least. Surely you can't afford to disregard the wishes of the public to such an extent. It'll be a great mistake if you do, in my opinion. So Norman sat silent for a minute. Then he spoke gently but firmly. He says, Clark, what in your honest opinion is the right standard for determining conduct? Is the only right standard for everyone the probable action of Jesus Christ? Would you say that the highest, best law for a man to live by was contained in asking the question, what would Jesus do? And then doing it regardless of the results? In other words, do you think people everywhere ought to follow Jesus' example as closely as they can in their daily lives? Well, with that, Clark kind of turned red and moved uneasily in his chair before he answered the editor's question. Why, yes, I suppose if you put it on the basis of what people ought to do, there's no other standard of conduct. But the question is, what is feasible? Is it possible to make it profitable? To succeed in the newspaper business, we have to conform to custom and the recognized methods of society. We can't do as we would in an ideal world. So Norman says then, do you mean that we can't run the paper strictly on Christian principles and make it succeed? Yes, that's just exactly what I mean. It can't be done. We'll go bankrupt in 30 days. Norman didn't reply at once. He was very thoughtful. We shall have occasion to talk this over again, Clark. Meanwhile, I think we ought to understand each other frankly. I have pledged myself for a year to do everything connected with the paper after answering the question, what would Jesus do, as honestly as possible. I shall continue to do this in the belief that not only can we succeed, but that we can succeed better than we ever did. So Clark stood up. He says, so the report doesn't go in? It doesn't. There's plenty of good material to take its place, and you know what it is. So are you going to say anything about the absence of the report? Norman says, no. Let the paper go to press as if there had been no such thing as a prize fight yesterday. Clark walked out of the room to his own desk, feeling as if the bottom had dropped out of everything. He was astonished, bewildered, a little excited, and considerably angered. His great respect for Norman checked his rising indignation and disgust, but with it all was a feeling of growing wonder at the sudden change of motive which had entered the office of the Daily News and threatened, as he so firmly believed, to destroy it. Before noon, every reporter, every pressman, every employee on the Daily News was informed of the remarkable fact that the paper was going to press without a word in it about the famous prize fight of Sunday. The reporters were simply astonished beyond measure at the announcement. Everyone in the typing and composing rooms had something to say about the unheard of omission. 2 or 3 times during the day, when Mr. Norman had occasion to visit the composing rooms, the men stopped their work or glanced around, looking at their cases and looking at him very curiously. He knew that he was being watched, but he said nothing and didn't appear to note it. There had been several minor changes in the paper, suggested by the editor, but nothing this big. He was waiting and thinking deeply. He felt as if he needed time and considered opportunity for the exercise of his best judgment in several matters before he answered his ever-present Jesus question in the right way. It was not because there were not a great many things in the life of the paper that were contrary to the Spirit of Christ that he didn't act all at once, but because he was still honestly in doubt about what action Jesus would take. When the Daily News came out that evening, it created a distinct sensation among its subscribers. The presence of the report of the prize fight could not have produced anything equal to the effect of its omission. Hundreds of people in the hotels and stores downtown, as well as regular subscribers, eagerly opened the paper and searched it thoroughly for the account of that great prize fight. And when not finding it, they rushed to the newsstand and bought other papers. Even the newsboys hadn't understood the fact of omission. One of them was calling out, "Daily News! Full count of great prize fight at the resort. News, sir?" A man on the corner of the avenue close by the news office bought the paper, looked over its front page hurriedly, and then angrily called the boy back. "Here, boy, what's the matter with your paper? There's no prize fight here. What do you mean by selling old papers?" "Old papers, nothing," replied the boy in dignity. "That's today's paper. What's the matter with you?" "But there's no account of the prize fight here. Look." The man handed back the paper and the boy glanced at it hurriedly. Then he whistled, while a bewildered look crept over his face. Seeing another boy running by with papers, he called out, "Hey, Sam, let me see your pile." And a hasty examination revealed the remarkable fact that all the copies of the news were silent on the subject of the prize fight. "Here, give me another paper," shouted the customer. "One with the prize fight account." He received it and walked off, while the two boys remained comparing notes and lost in wonder at the result. "Someone slipped a cog in the news, that's for sure," said the first boy. But he couldn't tell why, and he ran over to the news office to find out. There were several other boys at the delivery room, and they were all excitable and disappointed. The amount of slangy remonstrances hurled at the clerk at the back of the long counter would have driven anyone else to irritability. But he was used to it more or less most of the time, and consequently hardened to it. Mr. Norman was just coming downstairs on his way home, and he paused by the door of the delivery room and looked in. "What's the matter here, George?" he asked the clerk as he noted the unusual confusion. "Oh, the boys say they can't sell any copies of the news tonight because the prize fight isn't in it," replied George, looking curiously at the editor, as so many of the employees had done during the day. Mr. Norman hesitated a moment and then walked into the room and confronted the boys. "How many papers are there here? Boys, count them out and I'll buy them all tonight." Well, with that, there was this combined stare and wild counting of papers on the part of the boys. "Give them their money, George. And if any of the other boys come in with the same complaint, buy their unsold copies." "Is that fair?" he asked the boys, who had lapsed into unusual silence by the unheard of generosity on the part of the editor. "Fair? Well, yeah, but will you keep this up? Will this be a continual performance for the benefit of the fraternity here?" Mr. Norman smiled slightly, but he didn't think it was necessary to answer the question. Instead, he walked out of the office and went home. On the way, he could not avoid that constant question: would Jesus have done this? It wasn't so much with reference to this last transaction as to the entire motive that had urged him on since he had made the promise. The newsboys were inevitable sufferers through the action he had taken. Why should they lose money by it? They weren't to blame. He was a rich man. He could afford to put a little brightness into their lives if that's what he chose to do. He believed as he went on his way home that Jesus would have done either what he did or something similar in order to be free from any possible feeling of injustice. So, as we look back in that chapter, why do you think the editor felt obligated to leave the account of that fight out of the paper?
It was violence.
It's what?
It was
Violence,
violence.
okay.
He just probably thought some noble purpose with it.
Okay.
People bet money on fights.
Good point. Mimi says people bet money on those fights. And it was there. It's a very violent thing. Yeah.
It is pit two people against each other.
There's two people that enter this ring. Both of them are trying to beat the tar out of the other person, right? That is their sole ambition in that fight. And other people make money off of it. The fighters make some money, but probably not as much as the other people watching and so forth, right? So, what do you think? Did the editor make the right decision? I mean, it's going to cost him money down the road. You know, it's already costing him money. People were not buying the paper like they usually were. The people that were buying it were just really ticked off because it didn't have in it what they wanted to have in it. Did he do the right thing? You think Janet says yes, he did the right thing. Yeah.
Sometimes, you're caught
Okay.
You don't want to risk your reputation, you don't want to risk the money, you don't want to risk a lot of things, but in the end, if you do the right thing, I think you come out better.
Okay.
Or in society.
Yeah.
And I think, given time, the society would have adjusted to it.
Okay. We'll see. This is just.
Made their decision.
We've got another 51 weeks of that year to go, don't we? We'll see what they do if they adjust to it. Yeah. Good point, though.
I'm going to say something that's going on now.
Okay. What is going on now?
Christians are in the minority. The global Christians are in the minority now.
Okay. Christians are in the minority. Pardon me, I'm repeating so it can be recorded.
Okay, I just thought it was profound or something.
It was very profound, Mimi.
And, we've talked about this in Bible study several times about the homework channel.
Okay.
It used to be a safe place to watch TV and not have all the junk from this world thrown at us.
Okay.
Karen always says every movie ends with a kiss. And now, they've joined this mass of just putting in lifestyles that aren't Christ-like.
Okay, so Mimi's comparing what happened in this article here in the book to what's going on now with TV, with the Hallmark Channel that used to be goody two shoes, I guess. I mean, it wouldn't be, and I say that in a very good way. But you used to be able to count on them as being pure and clean and all, and you knew what to expect, and there wasn't anything. Yeah, you could watch it with anybody, and now they're not.
I just wonder what would happen if somebody asked whoever's in charge of that, the programming, to do that.
So what would happen if the person in charge of Hallmark broadcasting?
The movies.
Yeah.
What would happen if they said, let's go back to the other stuff that
Good point.
people want?
Mm-hmm.
Because nobody asked me if I want that junk in there.
Right. Yeah, I mean, we like watching the Hallmark Channel and knowing who's the good guy's going to get the girl and everything's going to work out. And now it's not always the kind of endings that we want it to be.
Like Cecil always says, Westerns are clean. There's no cuts, and somebody does get killed, but you don't see it. You don't see the blood. And
Yeah.
I think more and more people, maybe my age, are going back to the old TV because they can't stomach what's on.
Right. The old shows were a lot cleaner and there wasn't any hidden agendas. The thing that I hate the most is the fact that Disney has gone over to the dark side. Disney, I mean, used to, you could figure, a new Disney movie is coming out. It's going to be just, it's something that you'd take anybody to go see. It's going to be wonderful. And it's not always anymore. And again, we got that hidden agenda going on. And that's a shame. It would be... What are small? Blues Clues?
Blue Hound Dog.
Yeah.
They've got a homosexual couple.
Oh, really? In a children's cartoon?
And this is for babies.
Oh,
PBS has the male and female impersonators story time.
And
Cross-dresser story.
why would the networks be having the Blues Clues that is for preschoolers? Why would they be putting a homosexual lifestyle on those shows?
Encouraging, brainwash their kids.
Brainwashing them from the very beginning, right?
The parents are also watching most of the time.
Okay. Sometimes they are, sometimes they don't have a clue.
Yeah, sometimes they're babysitting.
Yeah, they just go in and watch TV. I'm busy. Yeah. Yeah. It's a shame, but that's why we're going through this book in a way. It's just so we can kind of wake up to the things. You know, who would have thought a week ago? Who would have in that town? Who would have thought anything about the account of a fight being included in the paper? They wouldn't have thought anything about it. But now the fact that it's not, because the editor said, enough, I'm going to take a stand. And this is my stand. I'm going to ask myself about every article that goes in my paper, every advertisement, would Jesus put this in his paper if he had a paper? So think about that this week when you're doing whatever it is you're doing. When you're looking at the TV, you're looking at a magazine or a newspaper or whatever. Is this something... Commercials. Yeah, oh yeah, the commercials. Go figure about the commercials. But just be thinking, what would Jesus do? That's on our sign out here. James put that up there for us this week. So think about that. What would Jesus do today? And then what would Jesus do for our church? How would he suggest that we grow it, and how we're going to get those 25 people, right, Janet? 25.
He might be turning over some tables.
He might be turning over some tables, yes. Remember, everybody has to bring 2.